Chapter 1. The Dive That Should Have Killed Him. The sky over western Germany in late 1943 is thin, bright, and treacherous. At 25,000 feet, the air is so cold that bare skin would burn, and the contrails of bombers and fighters hang like white scars across a pale blue ceiling. In that high, brittle world, a lone P-38 Lightning tips its nose over after a fleeing Bf-109, both aircraft knifing down through torn streamers of cloud and flak smoke. For a few seconds, everything feels under control. The nose just below the horizon, the altimeter unwinding at a familiar rate, twin Allison engines roaring in perfect sync. Then the Lightning's tail begins to tremble. The vibration deepens into a hammering shudder. The nose tucks farther under. The control column, so light a moment ago, stiffens in the pilot's hands and then may as well be welded in place. He has felt the beginnings of this before. He has watched squadron mates vanish into cloud in exactly this attitude and never come back. For a P-38 in a high-speed dive, the invisible forces are merciless. As the aircraft approaches transonic speed, shock waves form along the wing roots and burrow rearward, shifting the center of lift toward the tail. The horizontal stabilizer, designed for more gentle airflow, begins to stall. Instead of pushing the nose up, the tail loses authority completely. The result is a vicious tucking motion, as if an unseen hand is forcing the nose toward the ground. Pilots call it compressibility, but the word is clinical compared to the reality. An aircraft that suddenly will not obey its own controls. In Europe, Luftwaffe pilots have already begun to treat this quirk as a weapon. They let Lightnings close, then roll into shallow, high-speed dives, counting on physics to finish what their guns have not. Inside this particular P-38's cockpit, the script seems ready to play out again. Airspeed races past 400 miles per hour, the needle quivering toward a region on the dial that frontline pilots have quietly come to fear. The nose continues to steepen. The pilot hauls back on the stick with both hands and feels nothing but dead weight. At this altitude and speed, there is almost no time to think, yet the mind still finds room for images. Wreckage in a French field, burned aluminum on a German hillside, the memory of another pilot who never answered on the radio again. Training insists on certain reactions, throttle back, try to reduce speed, but those methods have failed enough men to feel like rituals before impact. What happens next does not come from any checklist. Reaching across the cramped cockpit, the pilot moves his hand not to the throttles, but to the engine controls. He snaps the mixture control for one engine to cut off and feathers the propeller. On the right side of the aircraft, the noise changes instantly. The deep, synchronized thunder of twin Allisons becomes an uneven growl and a rush of air over a stationary blade. One half of the sky goes strangely quiet. For a terrifying instant, nothing else changes. The P-38 still points down, still hurtles toward thicker air in the dark smudge of forest below. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the nose begins to rise. The locked control column starts to answer again. Not much, but enough that the pilot can feel the elevator biting into undisturbed air. The savage shudder in the tail eases. The dive angle shallows. The airspeed, instead of climbing toward the unknown, steadies and begins to bleed away. What textbooks insist should not work is somehow working. Above and ahead, the German pilot glances back and sees what looks like a crippled twin-engine fighter with one dead propeller falling behind in the dive, its pursuit broken. From that cockpit, the scene appears obvious. The American has pushed too far and paid for it. The Bf-109 begins to level out, its pilot already shifting attention from the fight to the flak and weather ahead. Behind him, the Lightning is not dying, it is recovering. As denser air grips the wings and tail, as the single live engine hauls the nose back into a controllable attitude, the pilot discovers that he has not only escaped the trap, he has learned something about how his aircraft behaves at the very edge of its envelope. He will nurse the P-38 back to altitude, restart the shutdown engine, and feel the vibration of two Allisons again. The experience will seem too strange, too reckless, almost too embarrassing to admit. Yet that single decision, to do the one thing every manual warns against, has just opened a crack in the wall that has been killing his friends. What began as a desperate gamble and a screaming dive will, once told and retold, force pilots and engineers on both sides to rethink what the Lightning can and cannot do. When the Lockheed P-38 Lightning first appeared in combat in 1942, it looked like the future arriving early. The twin booms and central nacelle gave it a shape unlike anything else in the sky. Turbo-supercharged Allison V10 engines promised speed at altitude. Tricycle landing gear and a concentrated nose battery of machine guns and cannon made it as modern as any fighter in the world. In the Pacific, the aircraft seemed to justify every bold line on the design drawings. P-38s escorted bombers deep over New Guinea and the Solomons, used their range to hunt Japanese shipping, and even flew the long, carefully plotted mission that intercepted Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's transport in April 1943, a flight that would become one of the war's most famous examples of air power reaching across an ocean. But the P-38 that shone in tropical skies did not behave the same way in the cold, high air over Europe. There, the Lightning carried a secret that even its designers did not fully understand when the first squadrons deployed to Britain. Above roughly 25,000 feet, when pilots pushed the nose over into steep dives, the aircraft could change character. Without warning, reports from training units and operational groups described the same pattern. A smooth entry, a rapid but manageable gain in speed, then an abrupt onset of tail buffeting, followed by a sudden nose-down tuck. The control column, usually so responsive, became immovable. Pilot inputs seemed to vanish into a void. Initially, these incidents were hard to interpret. Many early accidents were written off as pilot error, misjudged dives, or structural failures. Wreckage recovered from French fields and German hillsides showed aircraft that had hit the ground at very high speeds and shallow angles, often with power still on. Survivors who managed to pull out at the last moment spoke of elevators that refused to respond, of vibrations that turned to continuous hammering, of a sense that the tail had simply stopped being part of the airplane. In squadron dispersals and briefing rooms, the stories spread faster than the official memos. Pilots gave the phenomenon a simple, ominous label: compressibility. In the background, engineers at Lockheed and specialists at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, worked to put mathematics to those cockpit impressions. Wind tunnel tests and instrumented dives revealed what the pilots had felt with their hands. As the P-38 approached transonic speeds in a dive, local airflow over the wing roots and tailplane accelerated until it reached the threshold, where air behaves less like a smooth fluid and more like something trying to form a shock wave. Pressure distribution shifted. The center of lift migrated rearward along the wing. The tailplane, designed for a different regime, found itself overloaded and partly stalled. The elevator, still connected by cables to the pilot's hands, simply no longer had enough effective airflow to move the nose up. The airplane was not disobeying, it was trapped in a region of physics that pre-war designers had barely explored. On paper, the remedies were straightforward, but technically demanding. Dive recovery flaps under the wings could change the pressure distribution and restore authority to the tail. Structural refinements might reduce adverse twisting of the airframe. Carefully supervised test programs could map out safe entry speeds and recovery altitudes. In practice, the war moved faster than any engineering fix. Modifications took time to design, test, produce, and ship across oceans. Frontline groups in England flew early block aircraft without the latest improvements. In the meantime, German fighter units noticed what was happening. By mid-1943, Luftwaffe pilots on the Western Front had learned that the P-38 was dangerous if allowed to fight in its preferred vertical style, but also that it had a peculiar vulnerability in steep dives from high altitude. Diaries and post-war accounts describe German fighters rolling away from an attacking Lightning and easing into shallow, high-speed descents. If the American followed too aggressively, the outcome often played out the same way. The Bf-109 or FW-190 leveled at a lower altitude and sped away, while the P-38 either broke off early or disappeared into haze below, never to reappear. Inside some American units, the Lightning developed a quiet, unwelcome reputation. It remained valued for its range, firepower, and twin-engine safety in other phases of flight. But there were pilots who began to think of it as an aircraft that might kill its own aces if they misjudged a dive by a few knots or a few thousand feet. Training emphasized caution. Veteran leaders warned new arrivals about the wall that waited at the bottom of ill-planned pursuits. Yet telling men simply to hold back when the enemy broke away was not a satisfying answer. Something was killing pilots in the final seconds of dives, and until that was addressed, every engagement that began at altitude would carry a shadow. The quiet question hanging in briefing rooms was simple. If engineers could not solve the problem in time, could the men in the cockpits find a way to live with it? If you're enjoying this documentary, please like the video and share it with fellow World War II enthusiasts. Hit subscribe as well. Your support really matters and keeps this channel moving forward. From the first day twin-engine pilots climbed into advanced trainers, one lesson was drilled into them with almost ritual severity. Keep both engines running. Losing one power plant in flight was treated as an emergency, something to be coped with just long enough to get home or reach a field. Doing anything that might deliberately shut down a healthy engine was unthinkable. In multi-engine check rides, instructors watched hands on the throttles, on the mixture levers, on the propeller controls, making sure muscle memory never developed dangerous habits. Redundancy was the reason a twin-engine aircraft could fly further and survive damage that would kill a single-engine fighter. That redundancy was not meant to be tampered with. In combat, those assumptions hardened into doctrine. Aircrew manuals outline engine-out procedures in the dry, precise language of emergencies. Feather the propeller, trim out the yaw, reduce drag, maintain altitude if possible. They did not describe situations in which a pilot might willingly give up half his power in the middle of a high-speed dive with an enemy aircraft in front of his gun sight. Yet that is exactly what one P-38 pilot over Germany did when he felt compressibility begin to seize his aircraft. The engagement, as reconstructed from later accounts, followed a familiar pattern at first. A German fighter, bounced at altitude, chose escape rather than a turning fight, rolling into a diving run toward thicker air and home territory. The Lightning behind him had the initial advantage. Its pilot dropped the nose and advanced both throttles, feeling the reassuring surge of twin Allisons pulling the aircraft downward in pursuit. For several long seconds, the distance between hunter and hunted remained constant. Then, as the dive steepened and the airspeed needle crept into the red, the Lightning began to enter the danger zone that pilots now recognized with a kind of instinctive dread. Tail buffeting started as a subtle vibration through the seat and control column, then matured into a punishing shaking. The nose, which the pilot wanted to raise slightly to control his descent, instead insisted on tucking further under. Control forces increased until it felt as though he were trying to bend a bar of iron rather than move a set of cables and push rods. The German fighter ahead still appeared framed in the windscreen, but the American understood that he was following the other pilot into a region where his own aircraft might simply stop responding. He had heard stories in the mess about what happened next. The ground filling the canopy, then nothing. What makes the event remarkable is not that the pilot recognized the pattern, but that he chose a response no instructor would have endorsed. With normal control inputs failing, he reached for something that might change the airflow over the tail rather than the position of the elevator alone. His hand went to the mixture control for one engine. He cut fuel, watched the tachometer wind down, and feathered the propeller to reduce drag on that side. It was a move that, according to standard logic, should have made a bad situation worse. Asymmetric power at high speed was usually associated with sudden rolls, violent yaws, and the risk of structural overload. Instead, the effect was different. The exact aerodynamic reasons would be argued later by specialists, but in the cockpit, the sensation was simple. Shutting down one engine changed the balance of forces along the aircraft's length. The dead propeller, once a spinning disc creating drag and complex airflow, now presented a slim, feathered blade. The reduction in thrust and altered pressure distribution eased the load on the tailplane just enough for the elevator to start biting again. The pilot braced for the onset of a roll, instead felt the nose respond. Slowly at first, then more willingly. The dive angle decreased. The shuddering eased. Some versions of the story suggest that he stayed in the dive long enough to regain a firing solution and send brief bursts of machine gun fire toward the German aircraft, which was now no longer certain of its escape. Whether or not that part is precisely true, what matters is that the Lightning did not tumble or break apart. It emerged from the dive battered but intact, then clawed its way back to a safer altitude on a single engine. In denser air, the pilot restarted the shutdown Allison, rebalanced the aircraft, and pointed the nose west toward home. On the ground, when the story was told in a debriefing room with maps on the walls and the smell of cold coffee in the air, reactions split along predictable lines. Engineers and maintenance officers focused on the risks. They imagined seized bearings from a cold restart, shock-cooled cylinders, and the terrible possibilities if a less experienced pilot mishandled the controls at such speeds. Flight leaders and combat veterans listened for something else, a repeatable pattern, a possible technique that might turn a one-way slide into the ground into a survivable maneuver. For the first time, someone had faced compressibility head-on and come back with a description of not just what killed him, but what might offer a way out. The maneuver did not yet have a name. It was not yet written in any manual. It existed only as a story told by one shaken pilot and heard by a handful of others. But in the strange environment of wartime aviation, where the gap between cutting-edge science and a seat-of-the-pants flying was often no more than a sheet of aluminum thick, that was enough. The idea would not stay in a single squadron for long. The official training documents remained silent about engine-off dives, but the informal network that connected fighter squadrons did not. In dispersal huts lined with flight gear, in smoky corners of mess halls, and in the cramped bedrooms of requisition farmhouses, the tale of the Lightning pilot who had beaten the wall by feathering an engine began to circulate. It moved on the same routes as every other piece of frontline lore, through transient pilots posted from one group to another, through ground crews talking while they swapped engines between tired airframes, through the quiet conversations that followed a near miss or the loss of a friend. Some listeners dismissed the story immediately. To them, it sounded like the kind of embellished account that grew in the retelling, a desperate act recast as deliberate technique. Others heard enough technical plausibility in the description to be intrigued. They knew how different the aircraft felt on one engine during training emergencies. They understood that changing power on a twin-engine machine altered more than just raw thrust. The idea that asymmetric power at high speed might modify airflow over the tail seemed strange, but not impossible. Curiosity rubbed against fear. Within weeks, that curiosity began to manifest in cautious experiments. Over home airfields in England, P-38 pilots climbed to altitudes that kept them above cloud and away from traffic. With plenty of vertical space to spare, they eased into shallow dives on both engines, watching the airspeed climb. Before the onset of any serious buffeting, they brought one throttle back or briefly cut mixture to simulate a failure, feeling for changes in stability. Some pushed further, repeating the profile with steeper entry angles or higher starting altitudes, always leaving themselves generous recovery margins. These were not formal tests. There were no instrumentation packages or chase planes, only pilots trying to map the boundaries of their aircraft with the tools at hand. Patterns emerged. Many of those who tried it reported that the Lightning, with one engine at idle or feathered, seemed less prone to the abrupt tuck that had marked so many fatal dives. They spoke of control columns that remained movable a little deeper into the speed range, of recoveries that required less brute force and more measured input. None of this eliminated compressibility. The basic physics still applied, but the engine-off technique appeared to shift the onset slightly, buying precious extra seconds and a few hundred feet of altitude at the point of deepest peril. Commanders and engineers soon found themselves trapped between caution and necessity. From a maintenance perspective, the notion of pilots deliberately shutting down engines at altitude was alarming. Every cold restart in thin, frigid air risked internal damage. The chance that a novice might mishandle the sequence and lose both power plants could not be ignored. Operationally, however, reports that pilots were returning from dives they once expected to be fatal were impossible to set aside. At higher levels, in technical branches, and at Lockheed's own facilities, The rumors reached test pilots and aerodynamicists already wrestling with compressibility in a more controlled way. They were conducting dive trials with instrumented aircrafts, measuring pressures and control forces, and evaluating proposed fixes such as dive recovery flaps. Adding single-engine profiles to those programs was a small step. Soon, controlled tests began that mirrored what frontline pilots were attempting on their own. Entries from known altitudes, progressive increases in dive angle and speed, deliberate transitions from two engines to one, and careful observation of how the aircraft responded. Reports from those trials adopted more formal language, talking about single-engine dive characteristics and asymmetric power effects on tailplane loading. Beneath the technical phrasing, though, lay a quiet concession. The pilots at the sharp end had stumbled onto something real. It was not a magical solution, and it carried dangers of its own, but it affected how the aircraft behaved in the critical seconds when compressibility threatened to lock it onto a collision course with the Earth. The challenge now was to translate a rough battlefield trick into a tool that could be taught without encouraging reckless experimentation. That meant defining entry speeds, minimum altitudes, and clear warnings about the limits of the maneuver. It also meant acknowledging, at least between the lines, that the formal systems tasked with keeping pilots safe had been forced to learn from the very men they were supposed to instruct. The question hanging over draft revisions of manuals and training syllabi was simple and uncomfortable. How do you codify a technique born of desperation without losing the sense of respect that made it work? For much of 1943, Luftwaffe fighter squadrons on the Western Front treated the P-38's dive behavior as a reliable ally. In unit briefings, German pilots were warned about the Lightning's long range and heavy nose armament, but they were also told about its peculiar high-altitude weakness. Operational experience seemed to confirm the lesson. When a P-38 latched onto a fighter's tail at altitude, one of the safest options was often not a turn or a climb, but a carefully controlled dive into denser air. Accounts from German veterans describe how this tactic worked in practice. A pilot, feeling the first tracer streak past his canopy, would roll and ease the nose down, not committing to a vertical plunge, but to a shallow, accelerating descent. The aim was not to outrun the Lightning in a straight race, but to tempt its pilot to follow just a little too far into a region where compressibility might seize the American aircraft. Time and again, German fighters leveled out thousands of feet lower, engines still strong, while their pursuers either pulled away early or simply vanished behind them. When colleagues later reported seeing P-38s tumbling or impacting the ground, the pattern felt confirmed. Then, as winter gave way to early 1944, that pattern began to fray. In debriefings after sorties over France and the Low Countries, some Luftwaffe pilots started mentioning P-38s that behaved differently. These Lightnings did not break off as soon, nor did they simply disappear from the fight. Instead, they stayed stubbornly in the rear quarter, riding out the dive longer than expected, sometimes even closing the gap at speeds where they had once seemed helpless. From inside a German cockpit, the change was disorienting. A pilot who looked back might see what appeared to be a crippled enemy fighter, one propeller motionless or feathered, the other still turning. To an eye trained by months of combat, that configuration signaled an aircraft in distress, perhaps already counting itself lucky merely to survive. It did not suggest a hunter deliberately adjusting its configuration to remain lethal at the bottom of a dive. The reality, invisible from the outside, was that some American pilots were now entering these pursuits with a new set of expectations. They understood that compressibility lurked ahead, and that if they ignored it, the dive would end in the usual way. They also knew from shared stories and emerging procedures that shutting down one engine at the right moment could change the onset of that dangerous regime. When they eased a throttle back or reached for a mixture lever, they were no longer acting in blind panic. They were applying a crude but tested technique to buy control where none had existed before. The result on certain days was that the old German rule of thumb, assume the Lightning will die before you do if it follows you down, no longer held. There were engagements in which a Bf-109 pilot, leveling out and preparing to rejoin his formation, instead found tracer fire still stitching the air around him, the P-38 behind having survived the dive and retained enough stability to fire. There were others in which the German escaped as before, but with a lingering unease that the maneuver had been more marginal than it once felt. Intelligence officers on both sides tried to keep up. Interrogations of downed American airmen occasionally produced hints of unusual engine handling during dives. Fragmentary reports at Luftwaffe headquarters suggested that Allied pilots were improvising ways around known weaknesses of their machines. The specifics remained murky. Combat rarely offered clear laboratory conditions, but the sense that the Lightning was changing filtered into planning. For fighter pilots, whose survival depended in part on an intuitive grasp of what their opponent's aircraft could and could not do, such shifts were profoundly unsettling. A familiar escape path, once trusted almost instinctively, had become less certain. The psychological impact went beyond any single engagement. It eroded confidence in doctrinal shortcuts and forced German pilots to hedge their bets in ways that cost time and options. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, every successful dive that ended with a controlled pullout and an intact airframe reinforced the belief that the P-38's flaws, while real, were not immutable. The stage was set for a broader transformation of how both pilots and engineers thought about turning weaknesses into weapons. The maneuver that had begun as a whispered anecdote and then as an improvised test slowly found its way into the more formal language of training and tactics. The engine-off dive never replaced structural remedies. It bought time for them. As reports accumulated from Europe and from controlled trials, Air Force technical orders started to change tone. Documents that had once treated engine-out flight solely as a contingency for damage or mechanical failure now included references to high-speed single-engine handling and recovery. These sections were carefully worded, hedged with warnings, but their presence alone signaled a shift. At Lockheed, engineers and test pilots continued their work on the Lightning's fundamental aerodynamic issues. Instrumented aircraft, flown by specialists trained to flirt with the edge of the envelope, made repeated dives from high altitude, their paths tracked by ground-based cameras and their control forces recorded by sensors. The data confirmed what frontline pilots had been feeling in their bones. Compressibility could not be wished away, but its onset could be managed. Adjusting trim, altering power, and using new hardware all affected how and when the tail lost effectiveness. One of the most important hardware changes came in the form of dive recovery flaps introduced on later P-38J variants. These small surfaces, mounted under the wings, could be extended during a dive to alter the pressure distribution and help keep the nose from tucking. They represented the classic engineering answer. Redesign the aircraft to behave better in the problematic regime. Combined with incremental strengthening and refinements to the tailplane, they made the Lightning more tolerant of aggressive, high-altitude tactics. Yet even with these improvements, training materials continued to emphasize respect for the dangers of high-speed dives and the need for disciplined procedures. Within that framework, the engine-off technique occupied a peculiar niche. Officially, it was described in measured phrases, often tucked into appendices or advanced sections of manuals as an option for experienced pilots facing compressibility in circumstances where other mitigation measures had failed. In practice, it remained something that was passed on most effectively in person, in briefings where leaders walked through dive profiles step by step, in training flights where newcomers were allowed to feel the onset of heavy controls and then see how power changes affected the aircraft's behavior, always at altitudes that left generous safety margins. The tactic demanded a different mindset. Instead of viewing engine redundancy purely as passive insurance, pilots were now encouraged, cautiously, to think of power plants as variables they might adjust dynamically to shape airflow and control responses. That required planning. A pilot contemplating a high-speed chase had to consider not only the enemy's likely moves and the flak below, but also his own entry speed, intended recovery altitude, and the sequence of power changes he would execute if compressibility appeared. Mistakes in timing could still be fatal. The trade-offs were clear. Cutting a healthy engine in combat risked leaving the aircraft underpowered at the worst possible moment if a restart failed. Asymmetric thrust at high speed, if mishandled, could provoke the very rolls and structural stresses everyone feared. The technique was never appropriate for inexperienced pilots whose hands were still full with basic formation and gunnery. But among veterans, the knowledge that there was an additional lever available in the most dangerous phase of flight changed the psychological landscape of combat. The P-38's reputation shifted accordingly. In some European groups, pilots had begun by calling it a widowmaker in bitter shorthand for the men lost to dive accidents. As dive flaps appeared on more airframes, as tactics matured, and as engine-off techniques were integrated into a wider understanding of high-speed handling, that label began to fade. The Lightning was still demanding. It still punished carelessness. Yet it also became a symbol of how quickly wartime aviation could evolve under pressure. By the time newer fighter designs and eventually jets started to appear in meaningful numbers, the P-38 had helped teach an entire generation of pilots and engineers that aerodynamic flaws were not static verdicts. They were problems that could be attacked from multiple angles, through hardware, through procedure, and through the willingness of people in cockpits to explore the edges of what their machines could do. In that sense, the insane engine-off dive had done more than save individual aircraft. It had demonstrated that the line between design and tactics was thinner than most peacetime manuals ever admitted. While the P-38's struggle with compressibility played out most dramatically in the cold, clear altitudes above Europe, the aircraft was fighting a very different kind of war over the Pacific. Their engagements often unfolded at lower heights, under humid skies, above jungle and ocean rather than snow-dusted fields. Japanese pilots flying nimble fighters like the A6M0 worried less about exotic high-speed aerodynamic regimes and more about the Lightning's brute advantages: speed and level flight, climb performance, and the devastating concentration of firepower in its nose. In those theaters, the P-38's twin-engine configuration had long been valued for reasons entirely separate from dive behavior. Long-range missions, sometimes involving hundreds of miles over empty water, made the reassurance of a second engine obvious. Crews told and retold stories of aircraft that had taken flak damage or suffered mechanical failures in one power plant and still managed to limp back to base, one prop turning, fuel gauges edging toward empty. Survival in those cases came from redundancy used in the most straightforward way. Yet even in this very different context, lessons from Europe seeped eastward through the Allied training and rotation system. Pilots posted from one theater to another brought their experiences with them. Technical bulletins summarizing findings from NACA studies and field trials circulated through headquarters. Somewhere in the dense text and diagrams were references to single-engine dives, asymmetric power management, and the peculiar ways in which twin-engine fighters behaved near the edge of the envelope. For Pacific pilots, the engine-off trick itself was less often directly relevant. Fewer fights demanded steep dives from the thin air, where compressibility bit hardest. But the underlying principle, that engine power was not a fixed quantity, that it could be redistributed and manipulated to change how an aircraft handled in critical moments, found resonance. Instructors began to talk more broadly about asymmetric thrust, not only as a hazard, but as a tool. Training flights included demonstrations of how varying power between engines affected yaw and roll, not just in emergencies, but as part of advanced handling. From the Japanese perspective, any such refinements were invisible. To enemy pilots trying to read the intentions of Allied aircraft from a few hundred meters away in the chaos of a dogfight, a P-38 with one propeller at reduced power or briefly feathered looked like a damaged machine, not one whose pilot was executing a deliberate procedure. Most of the time, they never saw it at all. Range, altitude, and the fog of war kept the subtleties hidden. What carried forward more tangibly was the P-38's role as an early teacher in the broader curriculum of high-speed flight. Whether over Europe or the Pacific, Lightning squadrons had to grapple with questions that would soon face every air arm in the world as speeds increased and jet propulsion emerged. How do pilots adapt when aircraft reach regimes where control surfaces lose their familiar authority? When is a design flaw something to be engineered out, and when can it be managed by taught technique? How much responsibility rests with the person at the drawing board, and how much with the person in the cockpit? By the final year of the war, the once controversial fighter had acquired a complex reputation. It was remembered as the aircraft that carried America's first aces of the Pacific to their victories, as the long-legged escort that helped shepherd heavy bombers into hostile airspace, and as the demanding, sometimes unforgiving machine that forced its pilots to become amateur aerodynamicists, whether they wanted to or not. The engine-off dive was only one thread in that tapestry, but it encapsulated the larger story. A problem discovered in blood and wreckage over Europe had led to a new way of thinking about power, control, and the uses of redundancy. Ideas that would matter far beyond any single battlefield where the Lightning flew. When the war ended and the world's air forces turned toward jets, the altitudes and speeds that had once seemed extreme to P-38 pilots became merely the starting point for new designs. Compressibility, shock waves, and control lockups, which had first been encountered as frightening surprises in dives, migrated into the language of engineering textbooks and formal training syllabi. Research laboratories, many of them building on wartime data, explored swept wings, all-moving tailplanes, and powered controls precisely to manage the regimes that had challenged the Lightning. Reports from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics distilled the messy, dangerous experiences of combat pilots into graphs and equations. In this more clinical post-war world, the specific maneuver born of a desperate decision in a German sky rarely received its own spotlight. Technical orders and training materials referred in general terms to engine-out procedures, to asymmetric thrust management, and to high-speed handling in multi-engine aircraft. The narratives were dry, emphasizing checklists and standard operating procedures. Buried in that material, however, was the same logic that had guided the hand reaching for a mixture lever years earlier. In certain circumstances, changing how and where power was produced on a twin-engine aircraft could alter its behavior enough to restore control. Modern air crews absorbed that idea early, often without realizing how hard-won it was. Transport pilots practice losing an engine on takeoff in simulators, learning how to counter yaw and maintain climb. Fighter pilots rehearse engine failures and recoveries at altitude, watching carefully how their aircraft respond when thrust becomes unbalanced. Instructors speak of flying the airplane first, of staying ahead of asymmetric conditions rather than reacting in panic. Few of them pause to trace those doctrines back to a time when such experiments were carried out without the safety net of a reset button. The human story behind the procedures never completely disappears, though. In unit histories and memoirs, accounts occasionally mention the period when P-38 pilots in Europe faced an invisible wall at the bottom of dives, and when rumors of an engine-off cure spread from mess hall to briefing room. They recall the fear in those years, the funerals for men who had ridden their aircraft into the ground, the frustration of flying a machine that seemed to betray them when they pressed it hardest. Against that background, the courage it took for someone to try the unthinkable stands out more sharply. The Lightning itself has long since left frontline service. Surviving examples fly at air shows or sit in museums, their polished aluminum reflecting hangar lights rather than flak bursts. Visitors see the distinctive twin booms, the central nacelle, perhaps a placard describing range, armament, and notable missions. Only rarely do displays delve into compressibility or explain that one of the aircraft's most important contributions to aviation knowledge came from a problem rather than a triumph. Rarer still is a mention of the moment when a war-weary pilot, staring at a spinning altimeter and an unresponsive control column, chose to shut down a perfectly functioning engine and discovered that his aircraft would live instead of die. Yet the influence of that decision lingers wherever pilots confront the edges of their flight envelopes. It lives in the expectation that air crews will question procedures when those procedures clearly lead toward disaster, in the understanding that design limitations can sometimes be managed creatively, and in the quiet respect for those who are willing to experiment in order to survive. The engine-off trick did more than confuse enemy pilots who thought they were watching a crippled twin-engine fighter fall away. It showed that survival can belong to those who refuse to accept that the rulebook is complete when reality says otherwise. In the end, the P-38 silhouette may be fading from the active sky, But the mindset that transformed a flaw into a tool endures. Every time a pilot practices an engine-out approach, every time an instructor urges a student to think about how power, control surfaces, and airflow interact, a faint echo of that high-altitude dive over Western Germany is present. It is there in the insistence that there is almost always another way to fly out of danger, if someone is willing to reach for a control nobody else thinks to touch. If you've made it this far, you're one of us, searching for the truth behind the headlines and the courage behind the silence. Subscribe to the channel, and let's keep exploring the hidden wars, secret operations, and untold fates that shape the world we live in.